it was really, for me, fascinating looking at some of the discussions and the points that were coming up in chat. Disagreement about the meaning of won't, and Khan, I know that you had a really interesting point about this particular function of won't, and the fact that almost certainly it's not going to appear in, I don't think I've ever seen it in a course book. Probably won't occur in a training course. So does it actually matter? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, and especially if we're, we have lots of, experienced teachers here in the audience with us, I think we should understand that we're not walking grammar books. I think that's people's biggest fear, isn't it?
Absolutely.
For teachers who've just entered the profession, that's their biggest fear. Or, oh no, what am I going to say if I don't know the answer? If my student comes up and maybe they've heard something in a song, or like the Queen dies, right? They've seen a headline somewhere. My student comes up and asks me, but didn't you say, or well, she died yesterday, why are they using the present tense? I think the best way forward for us is, it's something that I read in Scott Thornbury. There's a basic that you should know. There's a basic you should know, but you should also be aware that the English language is dynamic. That's what Diane Larson Freeman says as well. It's dynamic, its use changes, and much of what our students now will be exposed to, I believe, is a lot of non-standard use.
Yeah.
And I think as teachers, we should be prepared to accept that our students are going to come with these questions, and accept that we're not going to have the answer straight away. But I think what's important is to have the curiosity and the interest to go and find out why.
And equip them and ourselves with the tools in order to do that. And I think, certainly in my experience of EAP, seems to be happening there more than it perhaps does in the general English classroom, that students working with databases of language, in other words, using a bit of concordance software to look at corpus findings, or just look at the raw data, is actually a really compelling way of moving students towards an understanding that the answer comes from use rather than teacher gives the rule, but also that they can be engaged in that archaeology of language as much as we can.
Yeah. I also find that when you're teaching, say, general English, there tends to be a lot more variation. You'll have students who will possibly have been exposed to other varieties of English, or, now with social media and, people, a lot of my young people, they play games online. So they'll have been exposed to other things that people have said. So they'll have questions about that.
Yeah.
And that's very much, context-based, and usage is a bit more fluid, and non-standard usage, let's put it that way, non-standard usage is a lot more prevalent. If you're teaching, however, let's say English for academic purposes, and not being prescriptive here, but there are books, Swales and Feek, right? They've got that series, academic writing for graduate students, and then from that series they had smaller volumes like writing a literature review and your research story and methodology. And there is a little bit more descriptive, but it's kind of linked in with what we had talked about earlier, with the reason why a particular form is used. So they say, like, if you're reporting on previous studies, then that's the tense you should use. And when would you use, for example, when would you say Harris suggests, or Harris suggested. You know, so there it tends, especially I think in written varieties, in written genres, there's a bit more prescriptivism there.
That's the word, I think, more and more is genre. And I think it also explains a point that Gabby has raised about changes in the language. You've referred to language as a dynamic system, not just English. I think, you know, other than Latin and Greek, the dead languages that are still in use for communication are very much live, they're dynamic, that actually I think genre is very often the way in. So, you know, that point about text speak, that the reduced use of punctuation seems to me to be directly related to the medium.
Yeah.
And, you know, it wouldn't be appropriate in a contract to leave out full stops and commas, which may have an impact on meaning. But I think in terms of text speak, where clearly the syntax indicates it's a question, then, you know, do you need a question mark? I don't know. Some very interesting points coming in from Mustafa, who I know has a particular interest in global Englishes, in the plural, in English as a lingua franca, about variation. And he refers to different Englishes, Singaporean English, Thai English, Indian English. Any thoughts on how these, and it's important to recognize that these are genuine varieties, which can and have been codified. How do we deal with these when we also have a course book, which often is a global product, which almost inevitably, therefore, is providing only one canonical version of English? Any thoughts on how that?
I was going to ask you a question related to what would have been my answer to your question. Is there anything that you would consider, any aspect of an utterance or any aspect of grammar where, if it was non-standard usage, would you consider as just explicitly wrong? And for example, if a student said, right, if let's say we have the future form, okay, and many German speakers, they struggle with various forms of the future, so their go-to form is the will. The will future. So they would say to you, I will go to the cinema on Friday, or I'll do my homework tonight. And even though these have various different meanings, I understand that that's something they're learning. Maybe for them that's fluid and so on. However, if I had a student, for example, who said, you know, you're talking about your friends and he says, yeah, my friend John, he liked to play tennis, right? I would say, no, that's definitely wrong usage. That's, you know, English has a third person singular S. And that brings me back to this varieties. I mean, you say that they've been codified. I grew up in Singapore. I grew up with Singapore English. I'm not sure to what extent Singapore English has been codified. It's that we've got books about it, you know, to explain the structure of Singapore English. People have been encouraged to embrace that identity, Singapore English. Singapore English is mainly a spoken form. Yes, there's, you know, there's literature, you know, as we do, you know, fiction and things like that, written following the standards, the rules of Singapore English. Yet at an occupational level and at school level, the expectation is still to use standard English. I mean, in Singapore English, they don't use the third person S. You know, and I've seen, you know, friends in Singapore, they've got Facebook comments and they write posts on LinkedIn without, for example, the third person S For me, I know that's part of Singapore English, right? But I don't judge the person any less. So the question is, what non-standard usage do we accept? And what do we insist cannot be,
So I think in terms of what is right in Singapore, and let's take that third person S, I think it's about giving learners an awareness of choice, an awareness that in Singapore, the drop of third person S is part of that variety. And if they are working with other people through the medium of Singapore English, then that is an entirely acceptable variant. However, if they are working in contexts where they are working with other people from other language variants, then they should be aware that they may have different expectations of what is right and wrong, and for right or for wrong, but people will do it anyway, that the expectations of what grammar should be, if the drop of third person S is something that is not common globally among or within the speech community that exists, that people need to know that actually they may be judged negatively as a result, and give them choice to almost code switch within the language.
Yeah.
So, code switching has always been English and German, or English and Thai, or French and Chinese. But I think, code switching, I code switch when I'm working with Germans. I don't use the word projector. I use the word beamer.
Beamer, yeah.
Because I know that that's going to be more acceptable for my German audience. So I think it's about understanding not only your own position, and even if you're coming from a position where your language is considered to be a substandard variant, perhaps incorrectly so, at least be aware of how other people might see you and deal with you as a result. Which then leads me on to the first part of your question about, would I ever correct something? I think in medical English, it is absolutely essential when looking at a patient's case notes and writing that up in a letter of referral, that the use of the present perfect to indicate an ongoing condition, or the past simple to indicate that that condition is no longer active, that the patient has therefore recovered, is a point where I would correct it. Because otherwise the reader is not going to be clear about whether the symptoms are current or in fact have been resolved. And again, it's context specific. And it comes back to an extent to genre, doesn't it? You know, in a letter of referral, you need that information to be crystal clear, because otherwise the patient may be treated in the wrong way. Whereas I think in speech, if a group of business people are chatting and, talking about their summer holiday, they've just come back and it's their first team meeting, a mistake in the use of the present perfect or the past simple to talk about your summer holiday probably is not a matter of life and death in the same way as it could be in a medical report. Sorry, pardon me, it keeps coming back to genre.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me also of what I read in Scott Thornberry's book with Uncovering Grammar, that in some cases, right, when you help your learners acquire grammar or understand grammar, you should kind of get them away from, the way I say to my students, get them away from the things they hang on to. So like if they have, students like linkers, the adverbs of prepositions or, time adverbs, and students like knowing, oh, I've got last week in this sentence, so I have to use past simple.
Yeah.
And in in Uncovering Grammar, Scott says that we get people to do grammar, we have to provide them with that setting, with that context, to know what the meaning is that they're trying to get across, right? Without these additional cues and clues. And something I do with my students, for example, if somebody says, I'll watch a film at the weekend, then I would, ask them, so have you just decided this now? And they go, no, I've planned it. And then you could go, all right, okay, so you're watching a film, right? And so you get them there, where, and that's where they need to get to move away from having all these context clues, low context, low resource, but getting the correct meaning across.
Yes. And I suppose that is nicely exemplified in terms of grammar of choice. You referred to the tendency in terms of German speaker interlanguage to fix onto will as the future form. Something that I noticed with my parents, my mother was one of those people who was very precise. So, something had to be in her diary, the time confirmed, the rail ticket purchased, and all the rest of it, before she would use the present continuous. I'm seeing my friends for lunch on Thursday at 12. For my father, he might have had a random conversation with a couple of friends. They were like, it'd be good to catch up and have lunch sometime. He says, yeah, next week. Well, let's check. So for him, there was just this kind of hazy concept that sometime in the next week or 2 weeks, or maybe in the month, there would be a lunch meeting. But he was very happy saying, I'm seeing my friends for lunch next week. But for my mother, that would very much have been, I'm going to. And this is all down to grammar of choice, because I think all too often we present grammar as being kind of a binary, it's this or it's that. Rather than, well, actually, it does indicate something about us as individuals and how we see the world. And therefore, the grammar that we use is indicative not only of the fact itself, but it's also indicative of the speaker worldview. Now, we're getting terribly post-structural here, and I don't think here's the time or the place to go into that in detail. But I think it does make the point that grammar, when we correct grammar, be it a piece of writing or even some spoken utterances, I think what we often do is we overlay the rules of written language onto spoken language. And also we assume that the speaker meant this, when in fact they could have meant something entirely different. So that feedback perhaps is richest when we ask students to explore by asking questions. Well, when you said, what did you mean?
I think also, Neil, coming back and not to digress too much, for our audience, I think there are some things where you can say that's absolutely not accepted. So, notions of right and wrong. Okay. And I think there are some things where we have to move towards a more context-based, usage-based view of grammar, so where variation in certain structures is accepted, where variation doesn't necessarily impact communication, as an example. So if I had, well, maybe not so much for my trainee teachers, I don't necessarily want them going around saying, my brother, he like cake. So I would always, correct those kinds of errors. Whether they choose going to over the present continuous, or with my printer won't print versus my printer isn't printing, right? That there's a degree of acceptance there depending on context, depending on situation. If you have a student who says, we stopped to park,
yeah,
versus we stopped parking, there you have clearly with two different choices, the verb stop,
yeah,
followed by to infinitive or gerund. Those two different choices also present two very clearly different meanings.
Yes.
And I think that's what we as teachers, we have to be confident enough in being able to see that some things are accepted, some things, you've really is very much usage based, and
yes,
there's a right or wrong to it.
And it's interesting, a comment that's come in from Mustafa talking about the situation in India, where the ing form, in India, you'd usually hear people saying, I'm needing, I'm loving, where one would expect to hear, I need, I love. And I think it's a bit like that situation. And it's interesting, isn't it? In the UK, where, of course, there is quite a lot of regional difference in terms of accents. I used to work and live in the north of England, where no one would say bath, like having a shower. It was bath. And the grass was green, not the grass. And I think teachers generally were very happy with making a distinction between, okay, around here, you'll hear people say grass and bath, but if you go to other parts of the country, you're going to hear grass and bath. And yet perhaps teachers are less comfortable with I'm loving, I'm needing, which is a shame, because I think if we've got to the point where we tolerate difference in terms of accent, and perhaps even dialect in terms of choices of vocabulary, but we haven't quite got to the point where we are happy with tolerating difference in terms of variations of grammar. Nicola Jane makes the point in English, I'm loving your new outfit. Now, it's really interesting that if you have a look at Danny's book on reason-based rather than rule-based language, there's really quite a neat and clear explanation of why loving may well be the appropriate answer to love. I'm loving your new outfit. I mean, the context here could be you're in the your friend has just been shopping. You know that she was looking for a dress to wear for the Christmas meal, and she walks into the room with this new dress. She's saying, I'm loving your new dress. That indicates something, I think, about the relationship between the speakers and the fact that they know that this purchase was something that's happened just recently, and that it's kind of part of a continuum. And that the decision to purchase and now wear is part of a kind of an ongoing situation. She's been on the phone. Is it the blue one? Is it the green one? Which one should I buy? And then she appears in the room. So I think, again, that contextual situation of the use of the present continuous referring to an event which in the mind of both the wearer of the dress and the friend is actually an ongoing process. Okay, so the dress has been bought, but that was only half an hour ago, might predicate the use of the present continuous rather than the standard, I love your new dress.
I mean, my question to you is, does everything need an explanation? I mean, I have students who say, okay, so with state verbs, you don't use the present continuous, but look, the McDonald's advert says I'm loving it.
Absolutely.
Right? And then you sit down with students and you show them some sentences, and we have this one from Michael Carter's book, Grammar for English Teachers, with the two sentences. Do you like the concert versus are you liking the concert? And then you sit there and you're trying to explain things, and then in trying to explain it, you go into all sorts of philosophical realms. Sometimes it's just accepted usage. I think sometimes there's just no need to explain. However, if somebody does ask you, what's the difference between he's got a bath and he's having a bath, then yeah, you explain to them, or things like, you know, this fish weighs 60 kilograms and we're weighing the fish. Different meanings, different settings. So, you know, some things don't need to be explained, but let's hand over to Joseph, who had his hand up.
Yes, no, absolutely. Joseph, I don't know if you want to come on with the microphone or if you wanted to pop your question into chat, but we'd be delighted to take that question. Unfortunately, I don't have it immediately to hand. I can't see Joseph's name in chat. So Joseph, we're going to go to Salvatore's question in Q&A, but if you can put your question into chat for us, Joseph, if you're still here, then we can answer it after we've looked at Salvatore's. And Salvatore has asked, shall we grade grammar we are used to teach on the basis of specific students' level? Like teaching a simplified, almost stereotypical version of the full academic set of grammar rules. That might coincide, as you say, with their local English, rather than vice versa, reserve what we or universities are often debating about to very advanced students. So I think if I understand Salvatore, the question is really, at lower levels, do we teach a simplified or a part of the story, rather than teaching the whole story? And how do we make those decisions? Karen, what do you do when it comes to this? Because it's a tricky one, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure if you could say that there was a full academic set of grammar rules. That's number one. And if, like, I don't know how it is elsewhere, but I know that in Europe, especially if you're teaching at university, a lot of, you know, language that we expect from our students is based on the Common European Framework. And the Common European Framework looks at not specific structures or words that you should know. It actually defines your abilities according to what you should be able to do at various different levels. So then we do expect a particular standard, and we'll teach our students, will expect from our students, you know, if they're writing an essay, to use, for example, the correct conjunctions, to again, usage and choice based, you know, as to make their meaning clear. And if we look at, for example, it's something that I was doing, the European framework, you know, talks about, you know, having good grammatical control. And even at B2, which would be upper intermediate for those of you who are not familiar with the levels, even at B2, you can have occasional slips on non-systematic errors and minor flaws in sentence structure. And even if you have mistakes, these mistakes do not lead to misunderstanding.
So perhaps if we just illustrate that at a B2 level for, I don't know, the Cambridge first exam, we might expect the candidate to be able to self-correct the third person S for present simple in writing, but it might slip in speech, as an example.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, and it's the same in German schools. Students are expected to leave, you know, at the end of age 18, especially if they've done English for their 8-9 years of secondary school. Then, you know, we accept that there are errors, that there will be errors and mistakes. I find that the CEFR looks very much at communication. And even if you make mistakes, your ability to repair or to modify your speech, that is recognized, because that, I think, you know, being able to recognize that you've made a mistake, being able to repair your own discourse, even in an exam setting, in an oral exam or in a presentation, that is a skill that goes beyond just, you know, knowing your grammar book inside out?
Absolutely. I think I might have answered that question slightly differently. If we take some and any, then I wouldn't teach the stereotypical incorrect rule, because I think it just confuses students, because they are going to see, and therefore it becomes salient, examples of the language used with the so-called incorrect versions. So for example, with exam classes, first certificate as advanced, which I used to teach years ago, when we got to reported speech, I'd just actually say, right, we're not going to use the course book. We're going to do something different. And I'd start with actually challenging their existing knowledge of tense shift. And I'd show them things like Neil said he liked chocolate, Neil said he likes chocolate. I'd say, well, what's the difference here? And then I would teach them, or make available to them, hoping that they would then learn the choices that existed in terms of the different versions. I would then say to them, perhaps a couple of weeks later, once it had started to sink in, now you can go back and look at the course book and see how it differs. So I think if there's a bit of language in a course book where there are reasons for actually definitely disagreeing with how it's presented using the canonical prescriptive way, I will challenge it.
I actually, sorry to interrupt, but I've been in so many situations where I've just taught it, I've put the structure on the board, and I, in my natural speech, say something the total opposite. And then I catch myself and go, oh, dang it, I didn't teach that, change your language. But then I find that so difficult.
Yeah, definitely. Something else I just wanted to mention as we move from Salvatore to Irna's question, I think unfortunately we've lost Joseph in the meantime, is that the other thing I'd say is that don't hide from students who are low level, that when they are encountering a grammar form for the first time, it might be the present continuous, that there is more to the story as they go along. And this is perhaps particularly true of modals, where, you know, students will see can typically first for ability, and then suddenly they see can for something completely different, you know, polite requests. Yeah. Well, hang on, what's going on here? And I think it's fair to actually say to students, today we're looking at one example of how we use can in English, so that they are aware that they need to have a certain, you know, tolerate ambiguity. Don't load them with everything at the beginning. You know, if you try to teach all the uses of can to a group of elementary students, you're going to utterly confuse them. Don't do it.
So, and they're not going to need it. They're not going to need all the uses necessarily.
Irna then has a question about teaching grammar through text. And she's explained in chat that she uses the term recount text to mean a text which tells about past experiences. So I guess there's like a personal narrative. And she asks, I want to ask about teaching grammar through text. For example, when we want to teach the past simple, we can use this narrative, telling a story about yourself. Then, do we need to explain the pattern to the students as we teach them without text, or should we let the students get the pattern by themselves? So I think here we're talking about the old chestnut of inductive and deductive learning, where I think there has been a bit of a change in the last couple of years, and it's certainly affected how I work with inductive and deductive. What are your thoughts?
Well, if they've never been introduced, so I think the way I see it is, I mean, they still use that recount text method in German schools very much. Okay, they introduce a few verbs with the past tense. So they have a text. The students read a text first. They're supposed to understand the text, just the gist of the text. So they're not to worry about, unknown verbs. There's a lot of regular forms, regular past tense forms, and then they would have then the following exercise after, your traditional comprehension questions would be, we introduce now the past simple form, and we've got all the regular forms. Underline these in the text, so the students underline it. They know it's the regular form because of its position in the sentence as well, right? Subject, verb. So they know that it's the past tense form, and then they're then asked, or they're drawn to the irregular forms, and they're asked to underline them. It seems to work here in Germany with school pupils age 10. They're pre-intermediate, so they're usually below Cambridge first certificate, very much below, so they're at flyers level.
Yeah.
And it seems to work for them, but it works for them because they're very familiar with the structure, with these grammatical terms like subject, verb, object.
Okay, so I guess the point here is know your students, know what they're familiar with, and work within those parameters, but also to extend them. Don't stick to the parameters, but push the boundaries a little bit, so that they become better at what they're doing. There's been a lot of interest in the last 2 or 3 years in evidence-based teaching. And one of the things that is coming out, I think, is a question on the validity of or the ascendancy of inductive learning, grammar discovery. Give the students a text, get the students to notice the grammatical form that the teacher wants to be highlighted, and then the teachers work out, often by comparing with another grammar form, another tense, what's happening. So you might have lots of past simples, and then you might have some past perfects, and which here's a sentence which happened first. Now underline in the text other examples, what is the form, what's the meaning? Now I think at an intermediate level and above, there is evidence that inductive learning does work, and the idea that the students remember it better because they've worked it out for themselves. There is quite a lot of evidence that at lower levels that actually this doesn't work, and it can actually confuse the students, and they get so confused by the process. The cognitive processing overloads them, and as a result, it would have been much easier and much more memorable for them to be taught in the old-fashioned deductive way of, here's the grammar rule, let me now teach it, now go and practice it. So I think in terms of this kind of working with recount texts, whether you do it inductively or deductively, perhaps is related to an extent with level, but it's also related to an extent to knowing your class, and perhaps they are lower level, but they can cope with it.
Yeah.
And therefore great.
I think also with the inductive method is much more valuable, as you've said, with students at intermediate and higher, because they would have had, that basic level, and you're not teaching the grammar new, or you're teaching perhaps a contrastive form, and then they can work with that. At a lower level, especially with text-based grammar, I find that the texts are they're so inauthentic. I mean, you'd have to actually create a text that had only past tense forms, for example, or present continuous tense forms. And if you look at real authentic texts, I've tried to use text in my own teaching, you'll see that in any article that you get from the BBC, from the Guardian, from CNN, there's a number of various different forms. So you can't really isolate and say So let's look at all these, past tense forms, for example. And in the end, what the students are just doing is they're just looking at the form, but they're not going to understand the context of use, really.
The genre features are lost because you get this very false text that doesn't actually require the use of that particular form, because in fact the genre is teaching material, not communicative material.
Yeah.
I'm aware that we are rapidly running out of time. I think we've got time for one last question, which perhaps we both need to answer very quickly, very directly. And that's a question about using L1 in grammar teaching. How do we feel about the teaching of certain grammar points using the first language rather than, or as well as, the second language? For my point, I actually quite like it at low levels. I think it's helpful. Students respond to it. They get the point quicker. Obviously, it's difficult in multilingual classrooms where you may not speak the language of all of the students, and therefore you have to do it through L2 only. But if I was teaching in a context where I shared the mother tongue and I knew it well enough, then at lower levels, I would certainly use L1. What I might then do is use L1 and then summarize it in L2 in English.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, definitely with low levels. It's efficient. It saves time. That's my answer. That's my short and sweet answer.